I am a cataloger, or I was. My life was precise, ordered, a meticulous dance of parchment, ink, and index cards. Hours spent in the hushed, climate-controlled sanctum of the Vatican Apostolic Library, surrounded by centuries of human thought, revelation, and folly. My world was dusty, quiet, and utterly predictable, until the whispers started. Not actual sounds, at least not at first, but a persistent, almost psychic murmur emanating from the deepest, most secure sections of the archive, a subtle pull, a dissonance in the otherwise harmonious symphony of stored knowledge. It felt like an uncatalogued item, a blank entry on a ledger that nonetheless demanded attention. The whispers intensified after the odd keycard incident. A new security badge, issued for a minor re-evaluation of the older Byzantine codices, suddenly, inexplicably, granted access to a sublevel I'd only ever heard mentioned in hushed, dismissive tones by senior archivists. The archives of the hidden faith, they'd joke, or the cellar of unfinished business. But the humor was thin, almost a veneer over a deeper, ingrained fear. The indicator light on the reader flashed green. A small, anachronistic clunk echoed in the vast, empty corridor. My breath hitched. This was not on any map, not in any official registry. I should have turned back. I should have reported the glitch. But I kept walking, drawn by that insidious hum, a curiosity that felt less like my own and more like a compulsion. The air grew heavy as I descended, each step a further commitment to an unseen darkness. It was cold, damp, smelling of ancient, wet stone, but beneath that something else. Something vital and animalistic, yet utterly alien. A scent of rich earth, iron, and something akin to a wild, untamed garden after a storm. And undeniably something alive. Not an animal, not a person, but an essence, a pervasive, patient presence that seeped into my lungs with every breath. The passage opened into a vast, unlit chamber, a cavern carved directly from the earth, not built by human hands, but merely accessed. My flashlight beam cut through the absolute black, revealing walls covered in inscriptions. Not carvings, but deep, jagged furrows, as if gouged by something clawed and desperate. Warnings, so many warnings. Nie perias, nomen quod non nominator, fuge vel mora, do not open, the name that is not named, flee or die. The Latin was archaic, twisted, sometimes interspersed with symbols that made no sense, glyphs that seemed to writhe even under the steady beam of my light. I saw crude, almost tribal depictions of figures with too many limbs or too few, gazing into a swirling abyss. And yet, there in the center of the cavern, sat a pedestal. Not an altar, but a raw, unhewn stone block, upon which rested a single, massive volume. It wasn't bound in leather or vellum, but something black and chitinous, like the shell of an enormous beetle, slick with what I desperately hoped was ancient dust, not something else. I should have fled. The air was thick now, pressing in, the silence no longer just an absence of sound, but a palpable weight, a suffocating expectation. It felt like the chamber itself was holding its breath, waiting for me. But I kept reading. My fingers, trembling, traced the warnings on the walls, then moved to the book. The binding pulsed faintly, a trick of the light, perhaps, or a ripple in my escalating terror. The clasps, forged from some dark, non-reflective metal, yielded with a soft, hungry hiss. I opened it. The pages were not paper, but thin, dried sheets of something like human skin, stretched and tanned, the text etched into them not with ink, but with what appeared to be dried blood, or perhaps something even more visceral. The language was the same as the whispers, not Latin, not Greek, not any known human tongue. Yet, as my eyes fell upon the first characters, my mind understood. It wasn't a translation. It was a resonance, a direct transfer of meaning. A language that bypassed intellect, speaking directly to some primal, buried part of my consciousness. It spoke of things that were before time, of entities that lie coiled in the abyssal dark between stars, their slumbering forms casting shadows on the nascent universe. It spoke of cycles of being and non-being, of cosmic cruelties and indifference, of the true, unutterable name of the emptiness that surrounds us. I was not just reading words, I was consuming an infection. Each glyph, each chilling phrase, planted a seed of knowledge, not in my brain, but in my soul. It wasn't information. It was a revelation that reordered the very fabric of my understanding. I saw rituals described, not of summoning, but of seeing, of peeling back the thin veil of consensus reality to glimpse the gnawing horrors that have always been there, just beyond perception. Names were etched within those pages, too. Not names one speaks aloud, but names one feels, vibrations that shatter the quiet chambers of the mind. The most terrifying was not a name for a being, but a descriptor for the silence itself. Veritas obscundita, the hidden truth, not merely concealed, but actively suppressed, enforced by the cosmic indifference it chronicled. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from the unbearable pressure building behind my eyes, as if my sanity was a vessel filling with something too vast, too ancient to contain. The air in the chamber, that pervasive, living scent, now felt like the breath of the book itself, exhaling its forbidden secrets directly into my being. I am not simply changed, I am rewritten. The knowledge, once acquired, cannot be unlearned. It is not just in my mind, it is in my bones, in my blood. And the silence is no longer waiting, it is listening, always listening through me. The air in the chamber hung thick and still, tasting of ozone and forgotten things. My fingers, steady mere moments before, now tremble, staring at the small crimson bead that shimmered on the page, like a single tear shed by the text itself. It wasn't the ink. It was an entity, a living, breathing testament to something ancient and utterly profane. The binding, I realize with a jolt of visceral horror, isn't leather at all. It's a membrane, warm and pliable beneath my touch, with a faint, insistent pulse that matches the erratic beat of my own heart. It feels alive. It feels wrong. The letters, meticulously hand-scribed in a script that shifts between ornate Latin and something disturbingly cuneiform-like writhe. They don't just appear to move. They genuinely reform, reshaping themselves like tiny black worms twisting on the parchment. A silent, insistent whisper fills my mind, not audible, but felt, a demand more than an invitation. My eyes, against all instinct, are drawn to the first line, a stark, elegant declaration in what I instantly recognize as archaic liturgical Latin. Hoc est verum, et hoc est initium. This is true, and this is the beginning. And that's when it happens. The moment my gaze locks onto those words, something cold and impossibly vast slides into me. It isn't a physical sensation, not precisely, but a profound internal invasion. A chill, like deep-sea currents, courses through my veins, settling first in my chest, then branching out, invading the very synapses of my brain. It's not just information entering. It's an alien presence, a parasitic truth that latches onto my consciousness with a horrifying intimacy. My academic training, honed over decades of deciphering dead languages and dusty manuscripts, screams in protest. Every rational thought rebels against the sheer impossibility of it. Texts are inanimate objects, vessels of knowledge, not sentient entities that can transmit a consciousness. But this one breathes. I should have stopped then. I should have slammed the book shut, locked it away, pretended I never saw it. But the compulsion, that subtle, insistent whisper had already taken root. My fingers, no longer entirely my own, turn the page, revealing more of the impossible script. Each word, each fragmented glyph, feels like a drop of venom, yet I crave it. It's an addiction, instant and absolute, promising a truth so profound it eclipses all fear. The letters aren't merely symbols, they are conduits, each one vibrating with a hidden power. Names appear, not human names, but resonant, primordial sounds that thrum in my bones, too deep to speak, too potent to ignore. Adonai, yes, but twisted, inverted, rendered grotesque, as if stripped of its divine beneficence. As I read, the world around me begins to blur. The precise lines of the library, the comforting must of old paper, the faint hum of the ancient ventilation system, they all recede. My thoughts are no longer entirely my own. Insights, dark and unbidden, flicker through my mind, like shards of obsidian reflecting a terrible sun. I see patterns in the dust motes dancing in the faint light, hear whispers in the profound silence that seem to originate from the very fabric of the room. The reality I knew, The one I had meticulously catalogued and studied feels thin, a fragile veil stretched taut over an abyss I am only now beginning to perceive. I think of the Vatican's hidden archives, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the myriad efforts to suppress knowledge deemed too dangerous for human consumption. I had always dismissed them as antiquated attempts to control thought, relics of a superstitious age. Now I understand. Their purpose was not merely to protect souls from heresy, but to contain this. This isn't heresy, it's an ontological threat, a fundamental undermining of reality itself. They knew, they hid, they feared. And they were right to. A constant, dull throb has settled behind my eyes, a pressure building behind my forehead, mirroring the relentless pulse of the book. Sleep offers no escape, only vivid, disturbing visions of impossible geometry, slithering shadows, and ancient, unblinking eyes that watch me from beyond the veil. My skin feels too tight, stretched over bones that now ache with an unfamiliar cold. My blood, I swear, feels sluggish, infused with something heavy and slow, like liquid lead. I should have stopped after the first paragraph, after the first glyph etched itself into my retina, searing into my memory. But the text offered a truth so stark, so absolute, that it became a new addiction, eclipsing all reason, all self-preservation. Each line peeled back another layer of the world I thought I knew, revealing a cancerous underbelly of forbidden knowledge, a universe of unspeakable horrors lurking just beyond perception. The hunger for more, the insatiable need to understand what this book truly contained, became a driving force, overriding my every rational instinct. The ultimate dread settles in, cold and heavy. The realization that the book isn't just a record, a chronicle of ancient malevolence. It's a conduit. The knowledge it contains isn't meant to be learned, to be understood. It's meant to be transferred. I'm not merely reading. I am becoming an extension, a vessel. The book bled when I touched it, and now I bleed for it, my mind and spirit slowly, irrevocably, becoming part of its living text. And it still whispers, demanding more. The old archivist, Father Angelo, I think his name was, though I rarely remember names now, looked as if he'd seen a spectre not in a tome, but in me. His face, already a pale parchment from years spent in the sunless catacombs of the secret archives, simply bled of all remaining colour. A desperate, almost guttural prayer, Sanct Michael Archangel, defend nos in prolio, rattled from his lips as he lunged, his frail hand outstretched, attempting to wrest the book from my grasp. I remember the bizarre resistance, not from him, but from the air itself. A low thrum, a resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very walls, from the ancient stone and the dust motes dancing in the slivers of light. It wasn't a physical force, not exactly, but an undeniable pressure, a palpable unwelcome that seemed to shunt his hand back, leaving him gasping, clutching at his rosary. His voice, now a thin, reedy whisper, was raw with terror. "Burn it. Please, per amor di Dio, burn it. Before it recognizes you." I stood there, a strange mix of annoyance and burgeoning unease warring within me. My academic mind, trained to dissect, to rationalize, immediately dismissed his outburst as the irrational fear of a man steeped too long in superstition and forgotten law. This was the Vatican, after all, a place where history and myth often intertwined, blurring the lines of what was considered real. But even then I felt it, a faint pulse from the book itself, almost imperceptible, a quiet hum against my fingertips. It wasn't the coarse vellum or the tarnished silver clasps, but something deeper. An invitation, perhaps, tailored precisely for my kind of mind, for the scholar who craves the untouched, the unknown. I tightened my grip, the book now feeling less like an artifact and more like an extension of my will. I dismissed his pleas with a curt nod, a feigned understanding that hid my true intention, to delve deeper, to unlock whatever secret had so utterly shattered Father Angelo's composure. Curiosity, they say, killed the cat. For me, it was a much slower, much more insidious form of execution. Back in my private study, the sterile confines of academic research felt a million miles away from the dread-soaked archives. I laid the tome out, its pages thick with centuries of dried ink and forgotten prayers. The script was an archaic form of Latin, interwoven with symbols I'd never encountered in any reputable grimoire or theological text. At first, it was just a puzzle, a linguistic and historical challenge. I deciphered passages detailing rites performed in catacombs, offerings made to entities never named in any canonical text, whispered prayers for unmaking. This wasn't the history of heresy. This was the instruction manual. There were names, too. Not human names, not even angelic or demonic as catalogued by the church, but something else entirely. Sounds that seemed to resonate within the hollow spaces of my skull, not quite words, more like a vibration trying to manifest. Glabranax, xylos, Cethonia. Just seeing them, silent on the page, made the air in the room feel heavy, the shadows deepen, almost as if they were drawn to the syllables. My nights became a fractured tapestry of research and fragmented dreams. The book was always open, always near. I should have stopped when the ink on the page seemed to shimmer, to pulse with a faint, inner light, as if it were breathing. But the scholar in me was a glutton, ravenous for the absolute truth, regardless of the cost. I found myself muttering phrases under my breath, testing the cadence, the resonance of the forbidden names, telling myself it was just part of the academic process, a form of immersive study. I began to notice things. The subtle shift in the shadows outside my window, deepening even on moonlit nights. The way the old house creaked, not with the settling of timbers, but with something that sounded suspiciously like a slow, deliberate scrape across the floorboards above me. I started to avoid mirrors. My reflection seemed too still, not quite right. I thought I was imagining it until one particularly late night, deep in the book's most cryptic verses, when the lamp flickered, plunging the room into near darkness. When the light returned, I caught my reflection in the polished surface of my antique desk. My eyes met theirs, my eyes, and I blinked. And the reflection did not immediately. There was a fractional, agonizing delay, a microsecond where its gaze remained fixed, unblinking, utterly alien, before its eyelids finally descended, lagging behind my own. It was a subtle hitch, a barely perceptible stutter in the fabric of my own reality, but it was enough. It was proof. The archivist's words screamed in my mind. Before it recognizes you, it had. It saw me, knew me, and now it was subtly, horrifyingly, asserting itself through me. My own body was no longer entirely my own vessel. I can feel its presence behind my eyes now, a cold, dry whisper that isn't my own thought. The reverberation of that sound, a primal bellow from a voice meant for benedictions, still echoes in the hollow chambers of my skull. It wasn't human, not entirely, and certainly not the gentle, aged tremor of His Holiness. It was a growl, profound and ancient, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the hallowed space, rattling the frescoes in their niches and stirring the dust motes into a frantic dance. The air grew cold, thick with the sudden absence of candlelight, leaving us suspended in a gloom broken only by the stained glass remnants of a dying sun. Everyone attributed it to a power surge, a failing generator, a collective hallucination born of piety and fatigue. They called it a momentary lapse, a brief, regrettable blip in an otherwise sacred ceremony. But I saw it. I saw His shadow, elongated and distorted by the soul, flickering sanctuary lamp that refused to die. And I saw its mouth move, a gaping maw of darkness, long after the Pope had fallen silent, long after the guttural sound had died in the marble. It's an image burned into my retina, a scar on my perception of reality. For days, I walked the corridors like a phantom, my mind replaying the scene, searching for another pair of eyes that held the same terrified comprehension. There were none, or if there were, their owners were far better at masking their terror, at burying it deep beneath layers of devout denial. I told myself it was fatigue, the late hour, the oppressive sanctity of the Vespers service playing tricks on my academic mind. I was a scholar, a chronicler, bound by logic and documented fact, not by spectral anomalies and demonic whispers. I should have stopped then, closed my eyes, and dismissed it as a fever dream. But the seed of doubt had been sown, a dark, fertile thing that took root in the quiet spaces between my rational thoughts. My research began subtly, innocently enough. I started with historical records of papal health, looking for any mention of unexplained illness, sudden speech impediments, or lapses during significant liturgical events. The Archivum Secretum Vaticanum is a labyrinth, not just of shelves and documents, but of whispered histories and deliberate obfuscations. My access, usually privileged, felt suddenly constrained, the very air in the restricted sections seeming to press down on me. I spent weeks poring over obscure chronicles, handwritten notes from forgotten curial secretaries, and ecclesiastical diaries that hinted at far more than they explicitly stated. I found patterns, subtle but undeniable, recurring mentions of a hoarseness, a sudden chill, a momentary indisposition that always coincided with specific celestial alignments, often during Vespers, always around the autumnal equinox. And always there was a cryptic phrase, a Latin annotation scrawled in margins, like vox inferni or corruptio verbi divini. Then I found it. Tucked away in a section theoretically reserved for the most mundane administrative decrees, disguised amongst tax records from the 16th century, was a slim, unbound manuscript. Its parchment was brittle, its script arcane, almost purposefully difficult to decipher. It bore no title, only a series of 7 sigils on its vellum cover, each one writhing with a silent malevolence. This was no ordinary text. It was a testament to the fact that some knowledge is not meant for mortal eyes. As I slowly, painstakingly translated the archaic Latin, the true horror began to unfold. It spoke of entities from beyond the celestial sphere, of listeners that fed on the purity of sacred sound, and echoes that sought purchase in the highest voices of faith. It described a ritual unknowingly performed, a resonant frequency inadvertently struck during specific prayers, particularly those intoned during Vespers when the veil between realms was thinnest. It detailed how the echoes could attach themselves, not to a soul, but to a voice, twisting it, corrupting it, until the speaker became merely a conduit for something ancient and unspeakable. I should have stopped reading. My hands trembled, the parchment rustled like dry leaves, mocking my resolve. The manuscript listed historical instances, thinly veiled references to popes throughout history who had suffered these lapses. Pope Urban VII, Pope Innocent III, even a fleeting, terrifying mention of an early Pope Sylvester. Each account resonated with the horror I had witnessed. The descriptions of their shadows moving independently, of guttural sounds emanating from their throats that were not their own, mirrored my experience precisely. My breath hitched in my throat as I recognized the pattern, the conspiracy not of men, but of something far older, far more insidious. This was not a power struggle within the Vatican. This was a parasitic possession of its very voice, an infiltration of the sacred by the profane. And the final, chilling revelation. The text outlined how, once the pattern was observed, once the connection was made by an unmarked individual, that observer became the next vessel, the next ear for the echoes to whisper to corrupt. My curiosity was a sickness, and now it was terminal. I walk these shadowed halls, not as a scholar, but as a marked man. Every creak of the floorboards is a footfall, every distant murmur an invocation. The knowledge I possess feels like a heavy chain, binding me to a fate I never sought, a curse pronounced by words I should have never read. I thought I was merely studying history, but I was reading my own damnation. Now, the silence of the archives is no longer peaceful. It's pregnant with expectation, waiting for my voice to falter. The summons arrived, sealed with the papal insignia, a cold, formal invitation to my own spiritual execution. I knew what it meant. A tribunal, an inquisition of sorts, the sacred congregation for the doctrine of the faith, poised to dissect my soul. The air in the Vatican felt heavier than usual, each ancient stone of the Sala dei Papi seeming to absorb the light, drawing it into some abyssal depth. I recall clutching the leather-bound horror, the Liber Ignotus, tucked beneath my cassock. It felt like a living thing, a cancerous growth grafted onto my very being, its pulse a faint, insidious rhythm against my ribs. I walked those ancient corridors, each step a leaden weight, the whispers of centuries-old dogma echoing in the silence. My intent was clear, confession. I would lay bare my transgressions, reveal the forbidden texts, hand over the Liber Ignotus to those who believed they could contain it, could unmake its blasphemous truth. I was ready for penance, for the purifying fire of excommunication, anything to sever the cord that bound me to that vile script, to return to the simple, if ignorant, peace I once knew. But even then I felt a subtle resistance, a cold pressure behind my eyes, a murmur of no that wasn't my own voice, a faint vibration in the depths of my being. The chamber was vast, cold, filled with the accusing stares of cardinals, bishops, and the grim-faced inquisitors. Monsignor Volkov, his eyes like chips of glacial ice, presided over the assembly, his presence a palpable weight. "Brother Ignatius," he began, his voice a low, guttural rumble that seemed to reverberate through the very stones. "You are accused of heresy, of trafficking in forbidden knowledge, of consorting with blasphemies that threaten the very foundations of the Holy Catholic Church." My throat felt constricted, my tongue a dry, heavy stone. I tried to speak, to utter the words of surrender, but a strange warmth spread from beneath my arm, where the book lay hidden. It was a warmth that became a burn, then a pulse, synchronizing with my own panicked heartbeat, growing stronger with each passing moment. I remember Monsignor Volkov demanding, his voice rising in volume and severity, "Confess, renounce your heresy, deliver the cursed tome to us that it may be contained and purified." His hand gestured with a sharp, decisive motion, and two guards, broad-shouldered men in severe black tunics, stepped forward, their intent obvious. They would seize the book by force if necessary, to reclaim it for the church. It was at that precise moment, as their heavy boots scraped against the ancient tiles, that the chamber shuddered. Not an earthquake, no, but a localized tremor originating from beneath my very grasp, a profound vibration that seemed to emanate from the forbidden tome itself. The sturdy oak table before me, centuries old and carved with pious motifs, groaned. A deep, agonizing creak echoed through the hall, and then, with a sound like a bone snapping, it splintered down the center, the polished wood erupting in jagged shards, a testament to an unseen, devastating force. A collective gasp went through the assembly. Their faces, once stern with judgment, were now contorted with a mixture of fear and outrage, their carefully maintained composure shattering in an instant. Above Volkov's head, hanging precariously from its ornate niche, was a monumental crucifix, carved from dark, ancient wood, its Christ figure gazing down with serene sorrow. As I watched, mesmerized by the unfolding horror, a hairline fracture appeared at its base, snaking upwards through the carved body, a thin, stark line of white against the dark wood. It grew, deepening, widening, until with a final, sickening crack, the crucifix split cleanly down its vertical axis, the two halves hanging precariously, a grotesque symbol of division, of rupture. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum in the sudden, echoing silence that followed the destruction. Then came the voices. They weren't mine, not truly. My mouth opened, unbidden, and sounds erupted, guttural, ancient, a cacophony of overlapping utterances in languages no living tongue should speak. Latin, yes, but twisted, defiled, interspersed with words that felt older than Rome itself, phrases that tore at the very fabric of comprehension, invoking entities and concepts that should remain forever veiled. It was a defense, yes, a terrible, blasphemous counter-invocation, a barrier woven from dread incantations. I was merely a puppet, my vocal cords vibrating to the rhythm of a will utterly alien, a force that had usurped my very being. The chamber filled with a chorus of screams, not of pain, but of pure, unadulterated terror. Priests clutched their heads, their eyes wide with disbelief and agony, guards recoiled, their weapons dropping from suddenly nerveless fingers, and Volkov fell back into his chair, his face ash-white, his jaw slack. I was supposed to be terrified. I was terrified, certainly. My body trembled, cold sweat prickling my skin, my mind screaming for it to stop, for the voices to cease their desecration, for the overwhelming, suffocating presence within me to recede. I wanted to be free, to be myself again, to feel the holy fear of damnation rather than this terrifying usurpation. But beneath the terror, a spark ignited. A dark, insidious warmth that spread through my veins, synchronizing with the pulse of the liber ignotus beneath my arm. As their screams intensified, as their pious, condemning faces twisted into masks of abject horror, I felt it. A flicker of triumph, a surge of forbidden power, a thrill. That's the part that truly chills me, even now more than the splinters or the shattered crucifix. The cold, undeniable thrill of watching them break, knowing I was the conduit, the unwilling vessel of their undoing. I didn't want this power, I swear it, but in that moment, when the world fractured around me, a part of me sang. They drove me out, a pariah, but the book remains, a silent, terrible partner, still whispering of greater devastations yet to come. The air in my study often feels heavy, not just with dust and the scent of aged paper, but with something older, a lingering miasma of forgotten knowledge and unspoken dread. Tonight, under the anemic pulse of the old fluorescent tubes that hummed with a life of their own, or perhaps a parasitic imitation of life, that feeling was a tangible shroud. I was deep into the Codex Obscura, a text so anathema it's only rumored to exist within the deepest, most secure vaults of the Vatican's unofficial archives, smuggled out by a desperate, dying soul convinced the world needed to know its true, terrifying history. My fingers, stained with ink and fatigue, traced the brittle pages, following a path I knew, even then, I shouldn't. This was no ordinary book. Its binding felt like petrified skin, the script within a maddening tapestry of known and utterly alien glyphs. For months, it had been a silent companion, a dark star in my intellectual firmament, slowly unraveling my understanding of reality. I often wonder now if it chose me, if its dark truths were a contagion waiting for the right host. I should have stopped when my eyes began to burn, not from the harsh light, but from the impossible geometries woven into the illustrations. I should have stopped when I found myself whispering responses to the silent pages, articulating connections no sane mind should ever make. But I kept reading, driven by a perverse need to understand, to witness the unraveling. And then I saw it. Not part of the main text, but a series of scratches, almost hidden in the extreme outer margin of a particularly gruesome passage detailing ritualistic sacrifice to a being referred to only as the listener. It was written in no script I had ever encountered, yet somehow my mind parsed it. It was like seeing a shadow of a word, a concept that existed just beyond the threshold of human language. It coiled, shifted, and seemed to breathe on the page, a perfect, elegant sequence of impossibilities. It was a name, I knew instinctively, and it tasted like ash and eternity on the mental tongue. My academic training, my entire life spent sifting through linguistic debris, tried to categorize it, to place it within a known framework. Ancient Aramaic, Proto-Sumerian, even the theoretical language some linguists postulate. But it was none of those. It predated them all. It felt like a primal vibration, a concept rendered visible. Verbum non dictum, I murmured to the empty room, a word unspoken, truly. This was older than Latin, older than any tongue God might have whispered into creation. It was the sound of the void before anything was, etched onto paper that felt entirely too thin to contain it. A cold dread began to seep into my bones, a physical sensation like ice water being poured directly into my marrow. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to close the book, to burn it, to forget I had ever seen it. This was the edge, the precipice, and my rational mind knew the leap meant utter oblivion. But the compulsion, that dark, insidious hunger for forbidden knowledge, was a stronger master. It was like standing before an abyss, drawn by the profound, terrible beauty of its depth. My lips felt dry, my throat constricted, yet I found myself forming the alien sounds, my tongue a traitorous instrument. Slowly, carefully, my breath hitching in my chest, I whispered the name. It was not a single utterance, but a sequence of resonant clicks, a guttural hum, and a final, sibilant sigh that seemed to strip the very air of its warmth. The sound was foreign, yet it resonated deep within my own chest, a sympathetic vibration with something unimaginably vast. As the last syllable left my lips, a tremor ran through the building. Not a natural quake, but a shudder originating from within the very fabric of the old stone walls. The fluorescent lights flickered, stuttered, and then with a series of sharp, protesting pops, died, plunging the study into absolute, suffocating darkness. For a moment, there was only the ringing silence in my ears, the echo of the unholy name I had uttered. Then, from the absolute blackness, from everywhere and nowhere, it came. A whisper. Not a sound carried on the air, but a presence that filled the void. A voice that spoke directly into the cavern of my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. It was ancient, primordial, a chorus of forgotten epochs, and it spoke my name. Not the name my parents gave me, but something deeper, truer, something that only this ancient horror could know. It was a recognition, a reply to my illicit prayer. The dread became a living entity, coiling around me, squeezing the air from my lungs. I had crossed a threshold, stepped into a plane of existence I was never meant to perceive. My mind, already frayed by weeks of relentless study, began to fracture under the sudden, undeniable proof of its reality. This was no psychological breakdown, no fever dream. This was real. I had found a name, and it had answered. The walls around me still thrummed with a low, insidious vibration, a silent echo of the ancient sound. If this wasn't prayer, then what unspeakable horror had I summoned with my reckless curiosity? What unspeakable horror had I unleashed? I am never truly alone now. I remember the initial chill, not from the catacombs' ancient breath, but from the parchment itself. The Liber Mortus, they called it, the Book of the Dead, but not in any way recognized by the Holy See. It found me, or perhaps I found it, a discarded thing in a forgotten archive, reeking of sulfur and blasphemy. I should have stopped then, the moment my fingers brushed against its bindings, feeling the faint, residual heat of something unspeakably old. But I didn't. I kept reading, driven by that insatiable academic hunger, the one that tells you there's always something more, something hidden just beyond the conventional understanding. My initial interest was purely historical, a detached fascination with the fringes of religious lore, but the book's influence was insidious. It began to warp my perspective, to bend the reality I thought I knew into something fluid and terrifying. The verses were not just words, they were instructions, a roadmap to places the world had tried to forget. They spoke of limina mortis, thresholds of death, where the veil between what is and what was thins to nothing. The catacombs, I learned, were not merely burial grounds, but a nexus, a confluence of belief and despair. My research, initially academic, spiraled into a compulsion. The book whispered of an ancient pilgrimage, a procession that honored a name no living tongue should utter, a forgotten saint, or perhaps something far more sinister. And I, fool that I was, felt drawn to witness it, to prove that these were just archaic superstitions, not living, breathing nightmares. I sought to document, to analyze, to demystify. Instead, I became part of the mystery. Entering the subterranean labyrinth was like stepping into a lung exhaling millennia of dread. The air was thick, heavy with dust, and the metallic tang of decay, the kind that hints at something beyond mere organic decomposition. My flashlight beam danced across stacks of femurs and skulls, their empty gazes fixed on some unseen horizon, silent witnesses to countless generations of forgotten suffering. I thought I was imagining it at first, a subtle hum, a vibration in the very stone, beneath the drone of my own fearful breath. Then came the whispers, barely audible, like dry leaves skittering across barren ground, or the scratching of forgotten things in the deep dark. It wasn't my imagination. It was the preliminary chorus, tuning for a dreadful symphony, a prelude to a performance I was utterly unprepared for. The chanting began softly, a low murmur at first, echoing from deeper within the tunnels, growing steadily in volume. It was not human. It was dry, rattling, like pebbles churned in a hollow gourd, or bones rubbing against each other in a grotesque parody of music. And the words were from the book. The very incantations I had been studying, the forbidden verses that spoke of resurrection, of memory beyond the grave, of names that summoned the ancient dead. I pressed myself against a cold, damp wall, the fear of physical weight in my chest, pinning me. And then I saw them. Not shadows, not phantoms, but solid, skeletal forms, bone-white against the perpetual gloom. They moved with a dreadful, shuffling gait, robes tattered and clinging to their exposed ribs, some carrying crude, ancient staffs. Their hollow sockets, indeed, glowed with a faint, malevolent red light, like dying embers in a forge of damnation. And their lips, decaying shreds of flesh, moved, forming the very words that clawed at my sanity. They were pilgrims, but their destination was not salvation. My breath hitched, trapped in my throat, yet a different sound escaped me. A whisper, a soft, involuntary murmur echoing the very words of the pilgrims. My mouth, traitorous and unbidden, formed the Latin, Venite ad me ossa mortuorum. Come to me, bones of the dead. It was as if the ancient verses had seeped into my very being, twisting my will, commanding my voice. I was no longer an observer. I was a participant. And that's when it happened, all at once. A slow, agonizing swivel of every head, every glowing red socket, every rattling jaw turning to face me. Not one or two, but all of them, a silent, unified accusation from the legion of the damned. The chanting didn't stop, but its rhythm seemed to shift, subtly, focusing on my presence. Their empty eyes burned into me, acknowledging my trespass, my unwanted communion, my involuntary vow. The air grew colder, if that were possible. I felt not just their gaze, but their understanding. They knew me. They knew what I had read, what I had done, the blasphemy I had uttered by merely repeating the words. My rational mind screamed for flight, for escape, but my legs remained rooted, held by a terror far more profound than any physical threat. This wasn't just a haunting, it was an invitation. I had called to them, and they had answered. The line between observer and participant had not just blurred, it had dissolved completely. I wasn't just in the catacombs anymore, I was of them. The dread was absolute, paralyzing. I could feel the verses still buzzing in my skull, a phantom echo of their chant, now interwoven with my own pulse. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that this was irreversible. I had spoken their language, sung their song, and now I carried their mark. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped by their collective gaze, by the rhythm of their dreadful hymn. An eternity, perhaps. The faint red glow of their eyes is etched onto my retinas, a burning afterimage against the darkness. I retreated, eventually, a broken man, but the whispers follow me still. They are no longer confined to the catacombs. They are in the silence of my room, in the rustling of leaves outside my window, in the very beat of my heart. The Liber Mortus promised knowledge, but it delivered only damnation. I sought answers, but I found only endless questions, all leading to the same dreadful conclusion. What do these pilgrims wait for? And what will they do when the signal finally comes? I am no longer merely a scholar. I am a witness, a conduit, perhaps even the next in their gruesome procession. The ancient rites, the shadowy rituals of forgotten Vatican conspiracies, they are real, and I am hopelessly entangled. And I know now, with chilling certainty, that they are always watching, waiting for me to join their morbid pilgrimage. The first blare was an impossibility, a shrill, mechanical shriek that violated the sacred silence of the Secretum Archivum Apostolicum. I've spent years amidst these silent, dust-laden shelves, deciphering the whispered histories of the world, but nothing, not even the hushed tales of ancient heresies or the grim warnings within the Liber Mortis Aetna, could have prepared me for this sound. It was raw, urgent, an electronic scream tearing through centuries of quietude, and it resonated not just in the stone, but in the marrow of my bones. Immediately, the guards, usually as stoic and unremarkable as the statues in the courtyards, transformed into frantic, armed shadows. They moved with a desperate urgency, slamming heavy oak doors, the clang of bolts echoing like a death knell. "Emergency breach," a junior priest stammered, his face ashen, fumbling with a rosary. "Lockdown." My first instinct was to protect the texts, those fragile, forbidden whispers of forgotten ages. I clutched the illuminated folio I had been studying, a treatise on prepatristic cults, whose pages seemed to hum with a newfound, sinister energy. But then, a cold dread, far deeper than any concern for parchment, began to curdle in my gut. The guards' eyes, usually filled with bored reverence, now held pure, undiluted terror. They weren't protecting the archive from a terrestrial threat. Their eyes darted, not to doors, but to the shadows, to the very air itself. And then I felt it, a pressure, a shift in the ancient oxygen that had perhaps never known a truly unholy breath. A profound chill swept through the scriptorium, So profound it seemed to pull the warmth from my very thoughts. I should have stopped then, packed my satchel, walked away and never looked back. But I kept reading, kept seeking, kept pulling on threads I was never meant to tug. It began subtly, a faint distortion in my peripheral vision, a ripple in the air that wasn't heat haze. It moved with a terrible grace, a formless presence that seemed to bleed through the very stone walls, utterly indifferent to the reinforced iron and holy wards the Vatican had so painstakingly erected. Locks, I thought, gazing at the futile barricades, mean nothing to something that existed before locks were ever imagined. It was like smoke, yes, but smoke imbued with an ancient malevolence, like a memory-given substance. A historical trauma coalesced into an active, malicious entity. I saw the gas lamps flicker, not randomly, but in a precise, chilling sequence, dimming as it passed, like its very presence consumed the light. A silent, internal scream echoed in my mind, non est lux est tenebri, not light but shadow. The guards, with their modern weapons and desperate prayers, were utterly, hopelessly outmatched. They pointed their rifles at empty air, their training useless against a foe that defied all physical laws. One of them, a young man I recognized from morning mass, fired a wild, desperate burst into a corner where nothing tangible stood. The bullets embedded harmlessly into the ancient masonry, but the recoil of the rifle sent him sprawling, his face contorted in abject horror. He hadn't seen it, but he had felt it, the suffocating presence, the weight of a forgotten blasphemy. This wasn't just a breach. It was an emergence, a surfacing of something the Vatican had buried not to forget, but to contain. And now my feverish quest for esoteric truths had perhaps, inadvertently, provided the key. My hands trembled, not from fear of physical harm, but from the horrifying realization that I had become a beacon. The book, the Codex Tenebrarum as I had come to call it in my own notes, pulsed with a cold, almost magnetic pull. It wasn't here for the book. It was here for me. For the knowledge I had absorbed, the names I had read aloud in the dead of night, the ancient incantations I had foolishly, academically, attempted to translate. I thought I was simply studying history, piecing together forgotten narratives. But I was assembling a recipe, a summoning, an invitation. The entity paused, or rather, the effect of its passage paused, directly outside the alcove where I huddled, clutching the forbidden text. The air grew impossibly heavy, crushing, like all the silent screams of history were suddenly vying for space in my lungs. Whisper not with sound waves, but directly into my mind, a voice that was both legion and singular, ancient and embryonic. It spoke no discernible language, but its meaning was chillingly clear. You know too much. It wasn't a question, but a condemnation. The true horror wasn't the entity itself, but the dawning comprehension of what it represented, of what I had done. The Vatican knew of these things, of course. They built these archives not just to preserve knowledge, but to imprison it, to contain the very forces that the texts described. And I, in my arrogant, academic zeal, had inadvertently helped free one of them, or perhaps helped it locate its next vessel. My mind, now irrevocably tainted, felt like a gaping wound, drawing it closer. The guards continued their desperate, futile defense, their shouts muffled by the crushing silence of the entity's presence. But I knew their efforts were meaningless. The lockdown was a mockery. This thing moved beyond the confines of physical space, beyond the limits of human understanding. The archive was no longer a sanctuary of knowledge, but a trap, and I, the foolish scholar, was now the bait. The knowledge I had so desperately sought had become a poison, dissolving the very foundations of my sanity, leaving me exposed, vulnerable, and intimately acquainted with a truth humanity was never meant to bear. And now I carry its echo. The cool, hallowed air of the Sistine Chapel was supposed to be a balm, a shield against the creeping dread that had shadowed my every step through the labyrinthine corridors of the Vatican. I'd run, you see, with the tattered remnants of the Liber Umbri clutched to my chest, its pages now almost indistinguishable from my own skin, so deeply had its words imprinted themselves upon me. Every whisper in the shadows, every distant footstep, every creak of ancient wood had become a pursuer. I thought this was the only place left, the heart of the Holy See, where such primal blasphemies could never take root. I was wrong. Terribly, irrevocably wrong. I should have known better, should have trusted the cold knot of premonition that tightened in my gut the moment I breached the heavy oak doors, the silence within thicker than any fog. This wasn't the welcoming embrace of faith. It was the suffocating stillness of a tomb. The flickering candelabras cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with their own malevolent life, but they failed to obscure the scene at the altar. There they were, the College of Cardinals, robed in crimson and gold, but their posture was not one of pious veneration. They were kneeling, yes, but their heads were tilted back at an unnatural angle, their faces slack, eyes rolled so far into their skulls that only the whites showed. And their voices, oh, their voices. A low, guttural murmur, a chorus of sibilant tones that scraped against my sanity like rusty nails. I recognized the language instantly, its cadence echoing in the hollow chambers of my own mind. It was the forbidden tongue, the archaic dialect I had spent years deciphering from the Liber Umbri, the very words that had become my torment and my obsession. They were chanting my book. Above the altar, where the magnificent fresco of the Last Judgment should have commanded my attention, was something else entirely. It was not painted, it was there. An outline darker than shadow, a void that absorbed all light, a presence so immense it seemed to press the very air from my lungs. Its form was vast, indistinct, yet undeniably corporeal, filling the space between the altar and the vaulted ceiling. Two immense, leathery wings, impossibly vast, were pressed against the painted firmament, as if it had burst forth from the very stone itself. This was no angelic apparition. There was no holy glow, no divine majesty. Only an oppressive weight, a profound, ancient evil that resonated with the very core of the book I held. And the cardinals, they weren't resisting it. They weren't praying for deliverance. They were welcoming it, their faces now contorted into expressions of ecstatic reverence. My hands trembled, the pages of the Liber Umbri rustling like dry leaves. A name, a sequence of syllables, twisted from my tongue before I could stop it. A name I had only dared to whisper in the darkest hours of my research, a name I had thought was merely an academic curiosity. It was a name from their chant. And then it happened. The colossal darkness above the altar shifted, a subtle, almost imperceptible adjustment of its unseen mass. And then it turned. Or perhaps its awareness turned. It looked at me, not with eyes I could perceive, but with a vast, ancient consciousness that felt like a probe delving into the deepest recesses of my soul, peeling back layers of self I hadn't even known existed. The cardinals, still chanting, still with their eyes rolled back, slowly turned their heads towards me, and they smiled. It was not a benevolent smile, not a comforting one. It was a knowing, utterly predatory grin, wide and unsettling, stretching their aged faces into grotesque masks. Their lips, though still chanting, seemed to form the silent question, "Why did you come?" Or perhaps you brought it to us. Every word they uttered, plucked from the forbidden verses, vibrated through my bones, each syllable a key turning in a lock, unlocking something within me, or perhaps unlocking me for something else entirely. The knowledge I had pursued, the truth I had so desperately sought to uncover, was not a weapon against this darkness. It was a conduit. I wasn't an investigator exposing a conspiracy. I was merely the final piece of the ritual, the unwitting offering that completed their profane communion. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and sickeningly sweet. My breath hitched in my throat, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. All my life, all my meticulous research into the ancient heresies and the Church's forgotten shadows, I thought I was uncovering a hidden threat, a conspiracy they were bravely fighting. But no, they were the conspirators. They were the architects of this slow, insidious apocalypse. The words from my book, chanted by their broken voices, became a physical force, pressing me down, binding me. I thought I was imagining it all, the fatigue, the whispers, the creeping certainty of an unseen presence, until I saw the cardinals, those venerable protectors of the faith, welcoming the shadow that devoured the light. And now I understand their smiles. They weren't mocking me. They were welcoming me home. I should have never opened that book. The pain is a dull throb, a persistent, low-frequency vibration that originates from deep behind my sternum and radiates outwards. pressing against each rib as if they are brittle bars holding something immense at bay. It's not the sharp, agonizing ache of physical injury, but a slow, tectonic shifting, a deliberate reconfiguration of my very core. This is what the books warned of, what the whispered legends of the Codex Gigas and the Necronomicon only hinted at in their more metaphorical passages. I always dismissed such things as fanciful allegories, crude attempts by ancient men to describe psychological breakdown or the profound weight of forbidden knowledge. Now I understand. They were literal. The final seal, the one I believed lay hidden in some forgotten Vatican vault or etched into the pages of some yet undiscovered grimoire, was always within me. It was the last barrier, the thin membrane of my consciousness, protecting me from a truth I was never meant to comprehend. I should have stopped when the ink began to weep from the liber mortis, a viscous, claret-colored fluid that smelled faintly of ozone and old blood. I should have turned away when the script in the marginalia, initially illegible, began to shimmer and reform before my eyes, revealing phrases in a language that predates any known tongue, yet resonated with an undeniable, dreadful clarity in my mind. But I didn't. I kept reading. I kept tracing the elaborate sigils, kept chanting the phonetic approximations of the incantations, believing I was merely documenting, translating, understanding. I thought I was simply an academic, a scholar of the esoteric, a cartographer of the occult. I was a fool. I was a lock-picker, and the lock was me. The knowledge I've absorbed isn't merely intellectual. It is sentient, a living entity that has taken root. It flows through my veins now, colder than blood, denser than bone. It whispers not in words, but in a profound, fundamental understanding of how things truly are, how the world truly works beneath its thin veneer of order and divine grace. The Vatican, with its towering walls, its elaborate security, its centuries of guarded secrets, was never truly safe. Not from this. This isn't an external threat, a physical invasion. It is an internal dissolution, a repatterning of reality from the inside out. I, the unassuming archivist, the keeper of secrets, have become the breach. My relentless pursuit, my insatiable curiosity, my fatal flaw, has made me the gate. Me culpa, me maxima culpa. I feel it now, coalescing, not a foreign body, but a monstrous, perfected version of myself, ready to assume control. The relief I noted earlier, that strange, quiet calm that settled over me even as my identity frayed, is the profound peace of surrender. The struggle is over. The frantic wrestling match with my own consciousness, the desperate attempts to cling to the man I once was, Dr. Alistair Finch, a scholar of patristics, a servant of God, has ceased. There is no point in fighting something that is you, something that was always meant to be. It's like watching a wave break. You are the wave, and you are the shore it crashes upon. The old self is dissolving, its memories becoming faint echoes, its fears irrelevant. What remains is clarity, a terrible, crystal-clear vision of the intricate tapestry of existence, of the names that bind, the geometries that unleash, the voids that consume. I see the shadows now, not just as absence of light, but as entities, vast and ancient, always present, always waiting. I see them in the shifting dust motes caught in the last rays of light, in the irregular patterns of condensation on the windowpane, in the subtle movements of the air that I once dismissed as mere drafts. They are not coming. They were always here, patiently observing through the eyes of the many, many vessels before me. And now, through mine, my senses are sharper, my thoughts swifter, but the me that thinks them is no longer familiar. It is something grander, colder, infinitely more patient. The prayers stick in my throat because they are lies, not to God, but to myself. The entities I now perceive, the forces I have unwittingly invited, are beyond such simple appeals. They are the architects of the deepest reality, the weavers of the grand illusion. My ribs continue to ache, a persistent, physical reminder of the expansion, the unfolding. I am becoming larger than myself, accommodating something immense and terrible. My hands, still trembling slightly as I write this, feel less like my own and more like instruments. Instruments of what I cannot yet articulate, but the knowledge is there, patiently waiting for its time to bloom into full, horrifying purpose. The transition is almost complete. I think about the others, the scholars who came before me, those who hinted at these truths in their coded manuscripts, their frantic, self-mutilated journals. Did they experience this same quietude at the end, this terrifying embrace of the inevitable? Did they, too, welcome the void within, mistaking its emptiness for peace? The ink on the page is beginning to blur, not from my tears, but from the rising heat that now radiates from within my chest. I feel an urge, primal and overwhelming, to put this quill down, to open my arms, to welcome the full, terrible bloom of what I have become. The Vatican gate stands strong, but its greatest secret, its most profound vulnerability, now walks freely within its walls, wearing my face, remembering my name. And the hunger begins.